Welcome to where time falls quiet.
Before the flood, the Sumerian record. No one talks about. What if the oldest document of human government contains a sentence that divides all of history into two fundamentally different worlds? Not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish, a bureaucratic notation, clinical and precise, marking the moment when everything that came before was swept away and everything that came after had to begin again. The Sumerian King List, carved into clay over 4,000 years ago, contains this sentence, and once you understand what it means, you cannot read history the same way again. The tablet itself is unassuming, small enough to hold in one hand, its surface covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform. Impressions that look, at first glance, like abstract patterns pressed into damp earth. But these marks are not decorative. They are a record, a genealogy of power. A catalogue of every ruler who held authority over the ancient cities of Sumer, stretching backward through time in a list so precise, so methodical, that modern historians initially dismissed it as impossible. The list names kings. It names their cities. It names the length of their reigns. And then, without warning, without explanation, it introduces a phrase that fractures everything that came before from everything that came after. Then the flood swept over. 5 words in English, fewer in the original Sumerian, but those words mark a boundary more absolute than any border drawn on a map. Before this line, the King List describes rulers whose reigns lasted tens of thousands of years. After this line, the reigns become measurably human, countable in decades rather than millennia. Before this line, kingship is described as having descended from heaven. After this line, it descends again. The text does not describe this as mythology. It describes it as chronology, as fact. As something that happened in sequence, one event following another, the way a scribe would record the delivery of grain or the construction of a temple wall. Imagine you are an archaeologist in the early 20th century. You have spent years excavating the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, sifting through layers of sand and broken pottery, searching for evidence of the civilizations that the Bible only hints at. You find tablets, thousands of them, libraries buried beneath the desert floor, preserved in clay that hardened 4,000 years ago and never softened again. You begin to translate. You expect myths. You expect legends. You expect stories about gods and heroes doing impossible things in impossible times. What you do not expect is bureaucracy. What you do not expect is a document that reads like a governmental archive, listing rulers in the same matter-of-fact style used to record tax collections and temple inventories. And what you absolutely do not expect is for that document to contain a single sentence that suggests human civilization did not begin. It resumed. The King List was not a singular discovery. Multiple copies have been found, carved at different times, in different cities, by different scribes. They do not all contain identical information, but they all contain the same structure. They all mark the same division. Before the flood, rulers with impossibly long reigns. After the flood, rulers whose lifespans fit within the boundaries of recorded history. This is not a storytelling convention. This is not narrative embellishment. This is a pattern repeated across independent sources, suggesting that the scribes were copying from something older, something they considered authoritative enough to preserve, even when the numbers made no sense to them. Consider what this means. The The Sumerians, who invented writing, who built the first cities, who created the first legal codes, who developed mathematics and astronomy and agriculture on a scale that allowed civilization to exist, did not describe themselves as the originators of these achievements. They described themselves as the inheritors. The King List does not say kingship was invented. It says kingship descended from heaven, ruled for an epoch, was interrupted by a catastrophic flood, and then descended again. The language is not metaphorical. The language is technical. The language is the same language used to describe the transfer of power from one city to another, from one dynasty to the next. The flood is not presented as divine judgment. It is presented as an event, a fact of the historical record. Something that happened in time and space, dividing what came before from what came after as completely as a blade divides cloth. The King List does not explain the flood. It does not describe it. It simply marks it, the way a geologist marks a layer of sediment or an astronomer marks an eclipse. The flood swept over, and when the waters receded, kingship descended from heaven once more. Here is where the text begins to whisper something unsettling. If the Sumerians inherited their civilization, if they understood themselves as restorers rather than founders, then what were they restoring? The King List provides an answer, but it is an answer that archaeology spent a century trying to ignore. The pre-flood kings ruled from cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These are not mythological locations, these are real places. You can visit their ruins today. You can walk through the archaeological layers and touch the walls that once stood when these cities were centers of power. The cities existed, the cities were real, and according to the King List, they existed before the flood. The list is not alone in this claim. The flood appears in Sumerian literature not once, but repeatedly. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains it. The Eridu Genesis contains it. The Atrahasis Epic contains it. Each text tells the story from a different angle with different details, but all of them describe the same sequence. A world that existed before, a catastrophe that destroyed it, and a remnant that survived to rebuild. The accounts are not religious allegory. They are presented as memory, as something that happened to real people in real time, preserved in clay, because clay, unlike flesh, does not forget. Modern scholarship initially treated these texts as mythological, as cultural narratives designed to explain natural phenomena or justify political authority. But myths do not require precision. Myths do not require multiple independent sources corroborating the same timeline. Myths do not require the kind of mathematical and astronomical detail that the Sumerian texts contain. And myths certainly do not require the kind of bureaucratic language that treats a world-ending flood as a simple chronological marker between one administrative period and another. The King List forces a question that historians have spent decades trying to avoid. What if the flood was not a myth? What if it was an event? What if the Sumerians were not inventing a past, but recording one? The text does not ask us to believe. It asks us to read, to notice, to pay attention to what the clay is actually saying. And what the clay is saying is that human civilization, as we understand it, did not begin with the Sumerians. It began before them. And the line that divides the before from the after is not gradual. It is not evolutionary. It is catastrophic. It is a flood. The phrase sits there in the clay, pressed into permanence by hands that turned to dust 4,000 years ago. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no elaboration, just a marker, a boundary, a line drawn across time itself, separating everything that humanity was from everything it would have to become. And if you listen closely, if you let the weight of that sentence settle, you begin to hear a whisper that modern civilization has been trying very hard not to hear, that we are not the first, that we are not the beginning, that we are the inheritors of something that came before, something that built cities and tracked stars and ruled for epochs until the waters came and reset the world. And the question that the King List leaves us with, the question carved into every copy of that ancient text, is not whether the flood happened. The question is, what came before it? And more importantly, what was lost when it swept over? The numbers in the Sumerian King List are absurd. That is the first reaction of any reasonable person encountering them. Kings who ruled for 28,800 years, for 43,200 years, for 36,000 years. These are not lifespans. These are geological epochs. These are the kinds of numbers you associate with ice ages and planetary cycles, not with individual human rulers sitting on thrones and making administrative decisions. The immediate instinct is to dismiss them as mythological exaggeration, as the kind of numerical embellishment that ancient cultures used to elevate their ancestors into the realm of the divine. But that instinct, however reasonable it sounds, ignores something crucial about the numbers themselves. They are not random. They are not arbitrary. They follow a pattern so precise, so mathematically coherent, that dismissing them as mythology requires ignoring the mathematics entirely. Let us examine the numbers more carefully, not as lifespans, but as values. The pre-flood reigns in the King List are not scattered across a wide range of possibilities. They cluster around specific multiples of a single base number, 3,600. One king rules for 28,800 years, which is 8 times 3,600. Another rules for 43,200 years, which is 12 times 3,600. Another rules for 36,000 years, which is 10 times 3,600. This is not poetic license. This is calculation. This is the application of a mathematical constant to generate a sequence of values that can be recorded, preserved, and understood by anyone who knows the base number. And here is where it becomes unsettling. 3,600 is not a random number in Sumerian cosmology. It is the Great Year, the period it takes for the precession of the equinoxes to move through a complete cycle of the zodiac, divided into specific intervals that ancient astronomers tracked with obsessive precision. The precession of the equinoxes is not something you can observe in a single lifetime. It is not something you can measure in a single generation. It requires centuries of continuous astronomical observation, with records passed down through multiple generations of sky watchers, each adding their measurements to a cumulative body of knowledge that slowly reveals the pattern. The Earth wobbles on its axis like a spinning top winding down, and that wobble causes the position of the stars to shift slightly each year. The full cycle takes approximately 25,920 years. The Sumerians knew this. They divided the cycle into smaller intervals, and the interval they used as a base unit was 3,600 years. This number appears everywhere in their mathematics. It appears in their astronomy, it appears in their architecture, and it appears in the King List, encoded into the reigns of rulers who supposedly lived before the flood. Now consider what this means. If the King List is mythology, if it is simply invented genealogy designed to give political legitimacy to later rulers, then why encode astronomical constants into the reign lengths? Why not use round numbers? Why not use numbers that sound impressive but lack mathematical structure? The answer is that the King List is not doing what mythology does. It is doing what a technical document does. It is preserving information in a format that allows the information to survive, even if the original context is lost. The numbers are not meant to be taken literally as lifespans. They are meant to be recognized as multiples of a cosmic cycle. They are a mnemonic device, a way of encoding knowledge about time, about celestial mechanics, about cycles that govern the movement of stars and planets, into a format that can be carved into clay and passed down through the generations. The Sumerian mathematical system itself is evidence of this kind of sophisticated thinking. They did not use a base 10 system like the one we inherited through the Greeks and Romans. They used a base 60 system, sexagesimal, the same system we still use today to measure time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary conventions. These are Sumerian conventions, and they are not primitive. They are extraordinarily sophisticated. A base 60 system allows for more factors than base 10, which makes division and multiplication easier for complex calculations. It is the kind of system you develop when you need to do astronomy, when you need to track planetary movements, when you need to calculate eclipses and predict celestial events with precision. But here is the problem that conventional history cannot explain. The Sumerians did not develop this system gradually. It appears fully formed in the earliest texts we have. There is no archaeological evidence of a simpler counting system that evolved into the sexagesimal system over time. The mathematics is there from the beginning, already complete, already functional, already being used to solve problems that require abstract thinking and multi-step calculations. Tablets from the city of Uruk, dated to approximately 3,200 years before the current era, contain mathematical tables that include multiplication, division, squares, cubes, and reciprocals. These are not basic arithmetic. These are tools for engineering, for architecture, for astronomy. And they exist at the very dawn of Sumerian civilization, as if the people who built the first cities already knew how to do advanced mathematics before they started building. The famous tablet known as Plimpton 322, housed in Columbia University, contains a list of Pythagorean triples, 15 rows of numbers that satisfy the equation where the square of one number plus the square of another equals the square of a third. This tablet predates Pythagoras by over 1,000 years. It predates Greek civilization entirely, and it is not a theoretical exercise. The numbers are too precise, too carefully selected to be the result of trial and error. Someone calculated these values using a method that modern mathematicians are still trying to fully reconstruct. The tablet does not explain the method. It simply presents the results as if the method was already known, already understood, already part of the standard curriculum for whatever educational system existed in ancient Mesopotamia. This is the pattern that repeats throughout Sumerian mathematics. Advanced concepts appear without precedent, without a learning curve, without the kind of incremental development that you would expect if a culture was inventing these ideas for the first time. The mathematics does not emerge from simpler systems. It arrives complete. And when you combine this with the astronomical precision of the King List, with the way the pre-flood rains encode precessional cycles, with the way the entire structure of Sumerian timekeeping is built around cosmic rhythms that require generations of observation to detect, you are forced to confront a possibility that conventional archaeology desperately wants to avoid. The Sumerians did not invent their mathematics. They inherited it. Imagine what that inheritance might have looked like. Imagine a world before the flood, whatever that flood was, where astronomical observation was already and established, where the precession of the equinoxes was already known, where mathematical systems were already developed to track these cycles and pass the knowledge forward. Then imagine a catastrophe, something that destroys the cities, drowns the libraries, kills the astronomers and the scribes and the teachers who carried the knowledge in their minds. But some of it survives. Not all of it, not even most of it. But fragments, numbers, constants, methods preserved in memory or scratched onto stones that somehow made it through the rising waters. And when the survivors rebuild, they do not start from zero. They start from these fragments. They copy what they can remember. They preserve what they can recover. And what emerges is a civilization that looks, from the outside, like it invented writing and mathematics and astronomy. But from the inside, from the perspective of the people doing the work, it is not invention. It is restoration. It is the desperate attempt to recover what was lost. The King List tells us this explicitly. It says kingship descended from heaven before the flood. It says the flood swept over. It says kingship descended from heaven again. The mathematics tells us the same thing in a different language. The numbers that should not exist. The astronomical constants encoded into reign lengths. The base 60 system that appears without precedent. The Pythagorean triples that predate Pythagoras. All of it points to the same conclusion. The Sumerians knew they were inheritors. They knew they were copying something older, and they built their entire civilization on the foundation of trying to preserve what came before, even when they no longer fully understood why the numbers worked or what the original context had been. The clay tablets do not say they invented civilization. The clay tablets say they restored it. And the mathematics, cold and precise and impossible to dismiss, agrees. Clay has a peculiar property that modern materials do not share. When it dries, it becomes permanent. When it is fired, it becomes indestructible. A clay tablet pressed with cuneiform script 4,000 years ago will outlast paper, outlast parchment, outlast digital storage media by orders of magnitude. Fire does not destroy clay tablets, it hardens them. Floods do not erase them. They bury them, preserving them in layers of sediment until someone digs down far enough to bring them back into the light. And what these tablets tell us, when we finally read them, is that the flood was not a religious parable invented to explain divine judgment. It was a witnessed event, recorded by multiple scribes, in multiple cities, in multiple languages, all describing the same catastrophe. The most famous flood narrative is the one embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It tells the story of Utnapishtim, the man who survived the deluge by building a boat according to divine instruction. But the Gilgamesh account is not the original source. It is a later copy, a Babylonian retelling of a much older Sumerian tradition. The original Sumerian version is found in a text known as the Eridu Genesis, named after the city of Eridu, which the King List identifies as the first city where kingship descended from heaven. The Eridu Genesis is older than Gilgamesh. It is older than the Babylonian Empire. It predates the biblical flood narrative by over 1,000 years. And it is not written as mythology. It is written as history, as something that happened to real people in a real place at a real moment in time. The tablet that contains the Eridu Genesis is fragmentary. Parts of it are missing, broken away by time and rough handling during excavation. But what remains is enough to reconstruct the narrative structure. The text describes a world before the flood, where cities existed, where kingship was established, where human civilization was already functioning. Then it describes a decision made by the gods to destroy humanity with a flood. One man is warned. One man is instructed to build a vessel. One man survives. And when the waters recede, kingship is lowered from heaven once more, and the cities are rebuilt. The language is matter of fact. The tone is bureaucratic. This is not a poet inventing a dramatic story. This is a scribe copying an account that was already ancient when he carved it into clay. Another flood text, known as the Atrahasis epic, provides even more detail. It describes the flood as lasting 7 days and 7 nights. It describes the boat being sealed with bitumen. It describes the survivors sending out birds to search for dry land. These are not abstract details. These are practical details, the kind of details that appear in eyewitness accounts, not in allegorical fiction. The text even provides a reason for the flood that is strikingly non-theological. Humanity had become too numerous and too loud, disturbing the peace of the gods. This is not a moral judgment about sin or wickedness. This is a description of overpopulation and environmental pressure. It is the kind of explanation that makes sense if you are trying to preserve a memory of what actually happened, even if the original cause is no longer fully understood. What makes these texts compelling is not just their content, but their distribution. The flood narrative appears in tablets found in different cities, written at different times, by scribes who had no direct contact with each other. Nippur, Babylon, Nineveh. Each city had its own scribal tradition, its own libraries, its own way of organizing and preserving knowledge. And yet all of them contain versions of the flood story. All of them describe the same sequence of events. All of them place the flood at the same point in their chronologies, marking it as the dividing line between an older world and the one that came after. This is not the result of one storyteller inventing a myth that spread through cultural diffusion. This is the result of multiple independent sources preserving the same memory. The consistency across these texts is striking. They all describe a divine warning. They all describe the construction of a vessel. They all describe the rising waters that cover the earth. They all describe the survival of a remnant. They all describe the gradual recession of the flood and the re-establishment of civilization. The details vary, the names change, the theological interpretations differ, but the core narrative remains stable. This is the signature of historical memory, not mythological invention. When cultures invent flood myths independently, the stories diverge wildly in structure and detail. When cultures preserve a memory of the same event, the stories converge on the same sequence, even when separated by centuries and different languages. Consider the precision with which these texts describe the flood itself. The Atrahasis epic says the storm began at dawn. It says the waters rose from below and fell from above simultaneously. It says the noise was so terrible that even the gods were terrified. It says the flood lasted 7 days. It says when it ended, the silence was so complete that all of humanity was turned to clay. These are not generic descriptions of water rising. These are specific observations about how the catastrophe unfolded. The detail about water coming from below and above simultaneously is particularly interesting because it matches geological descriptions of what happens during massive flood events. Groundwater surges upward as surface water pours down, creating a hydraulic trap that prevents escape. The tablets also describe the aftermath with the same clinical precision. The Gilgamesh version says that when Utnapishtim emerged from the boat, he looked out over a world transformed into a flat expanse of mud. He says the bodies of humanity were floating like flies on the surface of the water. He says he wept at the sight. This is not allegorical language. This is trauma. This is the description of someone who witnessed mass death and struggled to process what they had seen. The text preserves this emotional response because the emotional response was part of the memory. The scribes copied it down because they understood that the flood was not just a physical event. It was a psychological event. It was the moment when an entire world died and a handful of survivors had to carry the memory of what was lost into the new world they would build. Now consider what it means for these tablets to exist at all. Clay tablets are not easy to make. They require skill, time, and resources. The process of learning cuneiform script took years of training in specialized scribal schools. A scribe who carved a flood narrative into clay was not doing it casually. He was preserving something that his culture considered important enough to commit to permanent record. And the fact that multiple scribes in multiple cities, across multiple centuries, all chose to preserve the same story suggests that the story was not considered optional cultural heritage. It was considered essential knowledge. It was the memory of the event that divided history into before and after. It was the warning that needed to be passed down so that future generations would understand what had come before them and what could come again. The tablets do not ask us to believe them on faith. They ask us to read them carefully, to notice what they say and what they do not say. They do not describe the flood as punishment for specific sins. They describe it as a catastrophic event that happened for reasons the gods controlled, but humans could not prevent. They do not describe the survivors as morally superior. They describe them as chosen by warning, given advanced knowledge that allowed them to prepare. The theological framing varies from text to text, but the core mechanics remain the same: warning, preparation, survival, rebuilding. This is not the structure of myth. This is the structure of disaster protocol. And the fact that it was carved into clay, fired hard and buried in libraries across ancient Mesopotamia suggests that the people who wrote these texts believed they were preserving something that future generations would need to know. Not as a story, as a record, as proof that the world had ended before and could end again. In the winter of 1929, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient Sumerian city of Ur in southern Iraq. He had already made significant discoveries unearthing royal tombs filled with gold artifacts and evidence of elaborate burial rituals that revealed the sophistication of early Mesopotamian culture. His team had been digging through layers of occupation debris, carefully cataloguing pottery shards, broken tools, and the everyday detritus of urban life that accumulates when humans live in the same place for centuries. Then they hit something that should not have been there, a layer of sediment so clean, so sterile, so completely devoid of human artifacts that it stopped the excavation cold. Woolley ordered his team to keep digging. They went down 8 feet through nothing but silt, pure alluvial clay. No pottery, no tools, no bones, no charcoal, no evidence that humans had ever existed. And then, beneath that sterile layer, civilization resumed. Woolley understood immediately what he was looking at. This was not a natural accumulation of sediment from seasonal flooding. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly, depositing thin layers of silt that mixed with occupation debris and created the stratigraphy that archaeologists use to date sites. But this layer was different. It was too thick, too uniform, too clean. There was no gradation, no mixing, no evidence of multiple flood events layering over time. This was a single deposit, a massive inundation that had covered the city completely, drowning everything, and then receded, leaving behind nothing but mud. Woolley called it the flood layer, and when he traced it across the excavation site, he found that it extended in every direction, a horizontal band of sterility cutting through the archaeological record like a knife through cloth. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. Archaeology is built on stratigraphy. The principle is simple. Newer layers sit on top of older layers, and by carefully excavating downward, you can read history backward through time. Each layer tells a story. The pottery styles change, the tool types evolve, the building techniques improve. You can watch a culture develop, see it respond to challenges, track its innovations and its failures, all preserved in the dirt. But Woolley's flood layer violated this continuity. It inserted a blank space into the record, a gap where nothing human existed. And then, below that gap, the record resumed as if nothing had happened, as if the people who lived before the flood had simply been erased and replaced by a new population that started over from the same location. Woolley was not the only archaeologist to find this layer. As excavations continued throughout Mesopotamia, other teams began reporting similar findings. At the site of Kish, another ancient Sumerian city, archaeologists found a flood layer 18 inches thick. At Shuruppak, the city identified in the King List as the home of the flood hero, they found a layer of sediment interrupting the occupation sequence. At Uruk, the legendary city of Gilgamesh, evidence of massive water damage appeared in the stratigraphy. The layers were not identical in thickness or composition, which actually strengthened the case for a real flood rather than a mythological invention. A single catastrophic inundation would affect different cities differently, depending on their elevation, their distance from river channels, their local geography. The variation in the flood layers suggested that these were not literary copies of the same story. These were independent records of the same event, preserved in the earth itself. But here is where the conventional interpretation begins to fracture. The flood layers at different sites do not all date to the same period. At Ur, the layer dates to approximately 2,900 years before the current era. At Kish, the dates are slightly different. At Shuruppak, different again. This discrepancy has led many archaeologists to conclude that the flood layers represent different local flooding events, not a single catastrophic deluge. But this interpretation ignores something crucial about Mesopotamian stratigraphy. The dating methods are not precise enough to distinguish between events that happened within a few decades of each other. The flood layers could all represent the same catastrophic event, experienced at slightly different times as the waters spread across the region, and still show up in the archaeological record as separate events, because the margin of error in radiocarbon dating is larger than the time span of the flood itself. Consider what 8 feet of sterile silt means in practical terms. That is not the result of a river overflowing its banks for a few days. That is not seasonal flooding that deposits an inch or two of sediment and then recedes. 8 feet of clean sediment requires a water source massive enough to submerge the entire region, fast enough that people could not evacuate their possessions, and lasting long enough that when the waters finally drained away, there was nothing left to mark where the old city had been, except mud. The pottery was gone. The tools were gone. The buildings were collapsed and buried. The people were dead or displaced. And when the survivors returned, if any returned, they had to start over on top of a blank slate of hardened silt. Woolley himself believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood, He was not a religious fundamentalist searching for proof of scripture. He was a trained archaeologist applying scientific methodology to what he found in the ground. But he recognized that the flood layer matched the descriptions in the Sumerian texts, a catastrophic inundation that interrupted civilization, a dividing line between the world that existed before and the world that came after. He wrote extensively about his findings, trying to reconcile the physical evidence with the textual evidence and the theological implications. But the academic community largely dismissed his interpretation, preferring to explain the flood layer as evidence of local flooding rather than a regional catastrophe. The resistance was not based on the evidence, it was based on the implications. Because if Woolley was right, if the flood layer represented a real historical event that matched the Sumerian flood narratives, then the King List was not mythology. It was chronology. And the pre-flood civilization described in those texts was not invented. It was real. The earth does not lie. It does not embellish. It does not create narratives to justify political authority or explain natural phenomena. The earth simply records what happens to it. Water deposits silt. Fire leaves charcoal. Human occupation leaves artifacts. And when you dig through the layers, you are reading the biography of a place written in dirt and stones and broken pottery. The flood layer is a chapter in that biography, a chapter where human activity stops, where the record goes silent, where the only thing that happened was water, rising and covering and drowning everything beneath it. And when that chapter ends, when the record resumes, it does so with a population that had to rebuild from almost nothing, carrying forward only what they could remember or preserve through the catastrophe. This is not speculation. This is stratigraphy. The flood was not a metaphor. It was not a theological construct invented by priests to explain divine judgment. It was an event that left physical evidence in multiple sites across southern Mesopotamia, evidence that can be touched and measured and dated. The clay does not care about our interpretations. The clay does not care whether we believe the flood was global or regional, divine or natural, mythological or historical. The clay simply exists. 8 feet of sterile silt sitting exactly where the Sumerian texts said it would be, marking exactly the division the King List describes, proving that when the ancient scribes wrote that the flood swept over, they were not inventing a story. They were recording a memory. And that memory is still there, buried beneath the Iraqi desert, waiting for anyone willing to dig deep enough to find it, and honest enough to acknowledge what it means. When a civilization collapses, there is a signature pattern that archaeologists recognize immediately. The pottery becomes cruder, the buildings become simpler. The writing system, if one existed, degrades into pictograms or disappears entirely. Tool technology regresses to more primitive forms. Urban centers shrink or are abandoned in favor of smaller settlements. This is what collapse looks like in the archaeological record. A slow unraveling of complexity, a gradual loss of knowledge and technique as the survivors of whatever catastrophe caused the collapse struggle to maintain the sophistication of the world that came before. But this pattern, this expected signature of civilizational collapse and recovery, is completely absent from the post-flood Sumerian record. Instead, what appears is something that should not be possible: immediate resumption, full sophistication. As if someone pressed pause during the catastrophe and then pressed play again when the waters receded. The King List makes this explicit. After noting that the flood swept over, the text immediately resumes listing kings with their cities and reign lengths. There is no transitional period, no archaeological dark age, No centuries of wandering or relearning or slow rebuilding. Kingship simply descends from heaven again, and the administrative machinery of civilization starts functioning as if it had never stopped. The first post-flood king listed is Jusha of Kish, and his reign is given precise measurements just like the pre-flood kings, though now the numbers are human scale rather than astronomical. The cities mentioned after the flood are the same cities that existed before the flood, or they are new cities built with the same level of urban planning and architectural sophistication. This is not recovery. This is restoration from a template that survived the catastrophe. Consider the evidence from the city of Uruk. The archaeological layers immediately following the flood show no regression in technology or organization. The pottery is not primitive. It is wheel-thrown, professionally crafted, decorated with sophisticated geometric patterns. The buildings are not simple shelters. They are complex structures with foundations, drainage systems, and architectural features that require planning and engineering knowledge. Most significantly, the writing system that appears at Uruk shortly after the flood period is not crude proto-writing that gradually evolves into cuneiform. It is already cuneiform, already functional, already being used to record complex transactions, astronomical observations, and administrative records. There is no learning curve visible in the archaeological record. The writing system appears as if someone who already knew how to write simply picked up a stylus and started pressing symbols into clay again. The same pattern appears in mathematics. The tablets from early post-flood Uruk contain the same sexagesimal system that modern scholars assume took centuries to develop, but there is no archaeological evidence of that development. The base 60 system is there from the beginning, already complete, already being used for calculations that require abstract mathematical thinking. Tables of multiplication, division, squares, and reciprocals appear in the earliest layers of post-flood occupation. These are not the mathematics of people relearning how to count. These are the mathematics of people who retained knowledge of an older system and were applying it to the new world they were rebuilding. The numbers did not need to be reinvented. They needed to be remembered, and someone, somehow, remembered them. Astronomical knowledge shows the same impossible continuity. The Sumerians tracked planetary movements with precision that requires generations of continuous observation. Venus tablets record the rising and setting of the planet with mathematical accuracy. Lunar calendars account for the synodic month, with corrections that compensate for the difference between lunar cycles and solar years. Eclipse predictions appear in texts that suggest the observers understood the Saros cycle, the 18-year pattern that governs when eclipses occur. None of this knowledge can be developed quickly. It requires centuries of watching the sky, recording observations, detecting patterns, refining calculations. Yet it appears in the Sumerian record as if it was already known, as if the post-flood astronomers were not discovering these cycles for the first time, but confirming what they had been taught to expect. The architectural evidence is equally striking. The temple complexes built in the early post-flood period are not experimental structures that show builders learning through trial and error. They are sophisticated designs that incorporate precise measurements, astronomical alignments, and engineering solutions to structural problems. The ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids that dominated Sumerian cities, appear fully developed in their architectural form. There is no prototype phase, no evidence of simpler versions that gradually evolved into the final design. The ziggurats appear as if someone already knew exactly what a ziggurat should look like and simply built it according to a plan that existed before the construction began. This is the signature of inherited knowledge, not discovered knowledge. This is what happens when you are building from memory rather than from experimentation. Now consider what this means in practical terms. Imagine the world immediately after a catastrophic flood. The cities are buried under silt. The libraries are destroyed. Most of the population is dead. The survivors are scattered, struggling to find food and shelter, dealing with the trauma of watching their entire world drown. Under these conditions, you would expect civilization to regress. You would expect generations of struggle before urban life could resume. You would expect the knowledge to be lost, the techniques forgotten, the sophistication of the previous age reduced to legends that the survivors tell their children. But that is not what happened. What happened is that within a remarkably short period, cities were rebuilt, writing resumed, mathematics continued, astronomy proceeded, and the administrative structure of kingship was re-established. This is not what collapse looks like. This is what planned restoration looks like. The key word in the King List is descended. Kingship descended from heaven before the flood. Kingship descended from heaven after the flood. Not invented, not developed, not gradually evolved from tribal leadership into centralized authority. Descended, given, transferred from a source that existed independently of the human populations that received it. The language is consistent across multiple Sumerian texts. Civilization was not created by humans through trial and error. Civilization was received by humans as a gift or an inheritance from something that came before. And when that civilization was destroyed by the flood, it was received again, restored from the same source, allowing the post-flood world to resume at a level of sophistication that would have been impossible if the survivors were starting from zero. This is the pattern that conventional archaeology cannot explain without acknowledging the possibility that the Sumerians were telling the truth about their own history. They did not claim to be the inventors of civilization. They claimed to be the inheritors. They did not describe their knowledge as discovered through human ingenuity. They described it as preserved from an older source. The texts say this explicitly. The archaeology confirms it implicitly. And the only reason we resist this conclusion is because it forces us to ask a question that destabilizes everything we think we know about the origin of human civilization. If the Sumerians inherited their sophistication from something that came before the flood, then who or what existed before the flood to pass that knowledge forward? The post-flood record does not answer this question, but it forces us to ask it. Because what appears in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia is not the slow emergence of civilization from primitive beginnings. What appears is the sudden resumption of civilization from a template that somehow survived the waters. And that template, whatever it was, contained everything the survivors needed to rebuild a world that looked almost identical to the one that had just drowned. The flood narrative is not a Mesopotamian invention. It appears in cultures that had no contact with Sumer, no access to cuneiform tablets, no knowledge of the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. It appears in the Americas, in Asia, in the Pacific Islands, in Africa, in Europe. Over 200 distinct cultural traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all preserve stories of a great flood that destroyed the world and required humanity to start again. The conventional explanation for this global distribution is that flooding is a common natural disaster, and therefore flood myths emerge independently wherever humans live near water. But this explanation collapses under scrutiny, because these stories do not simply describe floods. They describe the same flood, the same sequence of events, the same narrative structure, the same impossible details that appear again and again across cultures that should have no connection to each other. Consider the pattern that repeats in these narratives. A divine warning comes to a chosen individual or family. The warning specifies that a catastrophic flood is coming. The chosen individual is instructed to build a vessel. The vessel is sealed. Animals are brought aboard. The flood comes and destroys everything. The waters rise above the highest mountains. Everyone outside the vessel dies. The flood lasts for a specific period, often given as 40 days, 7 days, or some other ritually significant number. The vessel comes to rest on a mountain or high ground. Birds are sent out to search for dry land. The survivors emerge. They make a sacrifice. They receive a promise that such destruction will not happen again. And then humanity resumes. This is not a generic flood story. This is a specific narrative template with consistent elements that appear in cultures as diverse as ancient Greece, Aboriginal Australia, and pre-Columbian Mexico. The Greek tradition preserves the flood in the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus sends a flood to destroy humanity because they have become corrupt. Deucalion, warned by his father Prometheus, builds a chest and survives with his wife. The flood covers the earth for 9 days. The chest lands on Mount Parnassus. They emerge and repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which transform into people. The details differ from the Mesopotamian version, but the structure is identical. Warning, vessel, destruction, mountain, resumption. This is not independent invention. This is the same memory filtered through different cultural contexts, expressed in different mythological frameworks, but preserving the same core sequence of events. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, who is warned by a fish that a great flood will destroy all life. The fish instructs Manu to build a boat and gather seeds of all plants and pairs of all animals. The flood comes. The waters cover the earth. The boat is tied to the fish, who pulls it to safety on a mountain peak. When the waters recede, Manu performs a sacrifice and begins the work of repopulating the world. The fish is later revealed to be an avatar of Vishnu, providing the theological explanation that the Greek and Sumerian versions also contain. The flood was divinely orchestrated, and the survivors were divinely chosen. The pattern holds. The warning comes from a divine source. The vessel preserves a remnant. The catastrophe is total. The survivors restart civilization on high ground. In China, the Gunyu myth describes a great flood that lasted for decades. The emperor orders Gun to control the waters, but Gun fails and is executed. His son Yu succeeds by dredging channels and creating waterways to drain the flood. The Chinese version differs from the Mesopotamian and Greek versions in that the hero survives by controlling the water rather than escaping it, but the core elements remain: a world-covering flood, divine intervention, a chosen individual who preserves civilization, and a new beginning after the waters recede. The consistency is not in the theological details, but in the historical framework. There was a world before, a flood destroyed it. A remnant survived, and the world after is understood as fundamentally different from the world before. Native American traditions contain dozens of flood narratives. The Hopi describe emerging from a previous world that was destroyed by water. The Ojibwe tell of a man named Wainabuju, who survives a flood on a raft with animals and recreates the earth from mud brought up by a muskrat. The Aztec codices describe multiple ages of the world, one of which ended in a great flood called Atl-Tlakenoli, the water fire which destroyed the fourth sun and required the gods to recreate humanity. These are not derivative stories borrowed from Christian missionaries or European colonizers. These are indigenous traditions preserved in oral and pictographic form for centuries before European contact, and they all describe the same catastrophe: water that covers the earth, a chosen survivor or group of survivors, and a new world that emerges from the ruins of the old. The Pacific Island cultures preserve the memory with remarkable consistency. In Hawaii, the flood story tells of Nu-U, who builds a large canoe and survives a flood sent by Cain, the creator god. In Fiji, the myth describes a flood that covers all the land except the peak of one mountain. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, the flood appears as the rising of the waters that separated the islands from the mainland, preserved in songlines that encode navigational and historical information in oral form. These cultures had no contact with Mesopotamia. They had no access to cuneiform tablets, yet they preserve the same memory. A flood that changed everything. Survivors who carried knowledge forward, and a world that had to be rebuilt from what was saved. The question that emerges from this global distribution is not whether these cultures independently invented flood myths. The question is why the myths are not more different. If flooding is a universal experience, if every river culture develops its own flood mythology based on local disasters, then why do the narratives converge on the same details? Why do they all include a warning? Why do they all include a vessel? Why do they all include animals? Why do they all place the flood at a specific moment in their chronologies, marking it as the division between an older age and the current age? The convergence is too precise to be coincidental. These stories are not describing local floods that destroyed a village or a region. They are describing a global catastrophe that required explanation and was preserved in memory across every continent. Provides context that mythology alone cannot. Geological evidence confirms that approximately 11,700 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose dramatically as glacial ice sheets melted. This was not a gradual process. It involved catastrophic melt events where massive ice dams failed and released volumes of water that could raise sea levels by several meters in a matter of days or weeks. Coastal populations would have been displaced. Island chains would have been submerged. River valleys would have flooded. The survivors of these events would have preserved the memory in oral tradition, passing it down through generations until it was finally recorded in written form by cultures like the Sumerians, who had the technology to carve the memory into clay and make it permanent. But even this explanation does not fully account for the consistency of the narratives. Sea level rise, even catastrophic sea level rise, does not explain why cultures separated by oceans describe the same sequence: warning, vessel, salvation, mountain, sacrifice, resumption. It does not explain why the flood is universally described as divine punishment or divine intervention rather than natural disaster. It does not explain why the survivors are always described as chosen, as selected by advance warning, as preserving knowledge that allows civilization to resume rather than starting from primitive conditions. The global distribution of flood narratives suggests something more complex than parallel myth-making. It suggests a shared memory of a shared catastrophe, a moment when the entire world changed and every culture that survived had to explain why they survived and what had been lost. The details diverged as the memory passed through different languages and different belief systems. But the core remained stable. The flood swept over. The old world drowned. The new world began. And every culture that tells this story, whether carved in cuneiform or preserved in oral tradition or painted in codices, is trying to ensure that future generations remember what the past learned at terrible cost, that the world can end, that it has ended before. And that the only hope of surviving the next catastrophe is to remember the pattern of the last one. Language is not accidental. When a scribe carves words into clay, especially words that will define how an entire civilization understands its own origin, the choice of vocabulary matters. The Sumerian King List does not say that kingship was invented. It does not say that kingship evolved from tribal leadership or emerged through social contract. It uses a specific word, repeated twice, that carries a meaning impossible to ignore. Kingship descended from heaven, once before the flood, once after. The word is not metaphorical. The word is technical. It describes a transfer of authority from a source that exists independently of human agency. And if we take the Sumerians at their word, if we accept that they understood their own history better than we do, then we are forced to confront a possibility that rewrites everything we think we know about the origin of civilization. Human government was not invented by humans. It was given to them, taught to them, transferred to them from something that came before. The phrase appears in multiple Sumerian texts, not just the King List. The concept of divine kingship, of rulers who govern by mandate from the gods, is foundational to Mesopotamian political theory. But the language is more specific than simple theological justification for monarchy. The texts describe kingship as a package, a complete system that includes not just political authority, but also the administrative apparatus required to exercise that authority. Writing, mathematics, law codes, taxation systems, resource management, urban planning, military organization. These are not skills that emerge gradually through trial and error. These are skills that require instruction, and the Sumerian texts consistently attribute that instruction to divine sources, to the Anunnaki, to figures who brought knowledge from heaven to earth and established the patterns that human rulers were expected to follow. Consider what this means in practical terms. When the King List says that kingship descended from heaven to the city of Eridu, it is not describing a king who claimed divine right. It is describing the establishment of an institution that already had a blueprint. Eridu, according to archaeological evidence, was the first permanent settlement in southern Mesopotamia, dated to approximately 5,400 years before the current era. But the city that appears in the archaeological record is not a primitive village that gradually develops urban characteristics. It is already urban, already planned, already demonstrating architectural sophistication and social organization that implies the existence of a governing structure capable of coordinating large-scale construction projects and managing resources for a concentrated population. This is not what you would expect if the people of Eridu were inventing kingship for the first time. This is what you would expect if they were applying a model that already existed. The post-flood resumption of kingship follows the same pattern. The King List says that after the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven again. The language is identical. The concept is identical. This is not a new invention rising from the ashes of the old world. This is the same institution being re-established according to the same template. And this is visible in the archaeological record. The cities that emerge after the flood layer are not experimental settlements where different political systems are being tested. They are organized from the beginning according to a pattern that includes central authority, administrative bureaucracy, temple complexes that serve as both religious and governmental centers, and a class of professional scribes who maintain the records that make governance possible. There is no learning curve. There is only resumption. The law codes provide additional evidence of this transferred authority. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dated to approximately 2100 years before the current era, is the oldest surviving legal code. But it is not primitive law. It is sophisticated jurisprudence that includes specific penalties for specific crimes, protections for the weak against the strong, and procedural rules for how disputes should be resolved. The prologue to the code says explicitly that Ur-Nammu received his authority to create these laws from the gods Anu and Enlil. He did not invent the laws, he codified them. He recorded what had already been established. And the laws themselves bear this out. They show evidence of precedent, of accumulated legal wisdom, of principles that had already been tested and refined before Ur-Nammu put them into written form. The same pattern appears in the Code of Hammurabi, which comes several centuries later, but follows the same structure. Hammurabi describes himself as chosen by the gods to establish justice in the land. The stele that contains his laws shows him receiving the code from the sun god Shamash, a visual representation of the concept that legal authority comes from divine sources rather than human innovation. The laws are comprehensive, covering everything from property disputes to family relations to commercial transactions. This is not the work of a single ruler inventing a legal system from scratch. This is the work of a scribe recording and systematizing laws that had existed in oral or written form for generations, organizing them according to principles that were already understood to be authoritative. The language of descent, of authority coming from above rather than emerging from below, is consistent across Sumerian political and religious texts. Kings are described as appointed by the gods. Priests are described as interpreters of divine will. Scribes are described as preservers of sacred knowledge. The entire structure of Mesopotamian civilization is built on the premise that humans are not the originators of their own institutions. They are the maintainers, the caretakers, the inheritors of a system that was established before they existed and will continue after they are gone. This is not false modesty. This is not theological rhetoric designed to justify political power. This is a civilization that understood itself as fundamentally derivative, as operating according to patterns it received rather than patterns it created. Now consider the implications if the Sumerians were correct. If kingship did not emerge gradually from tribal societies, but was established according to a pre-existing model, then where did that model come from? The King List provides an answer. It descended from heaven before the flood, functioned for epochs under rulers whose reign lengths are measured in astronomical cycles, was interrupted by a catastrophe that destroyed the physical infrastructure of civilization, and then descended again to allow the survivors to rebuild according to the same pattern. This is not myth. This is institutional memory. This is a civilization that knows it did not start from zero because it has records, preserved in clay, and passed down through scribal schools that describe what came before. The word descended is the key. It implies vertical transfer rather than horizontal development. It implies that knowledge and authority existed at a higher level and were brought down to a human level through a process of instruction. This is the language of inheritance, of education, of transfer from teacher to student, from master to apprentice, from a source that possesses complete knowledge to recipients who must learn and preserve what they are given. And if this is how the Sumerians understood their own civilization, if this is how they described their relationship to the institutions that governed their lives, then we have been misreading their texts for over a century. We have been treating their claims as mythology when they intended them as history. We have been dismissing their explicit statements about inheritance because we assumed that civilization must be invention rather than restoration. The alternative explanation, the one that conventional history prefers, is that kingship emerged independently in multiple locations as human societies became more complex and required centralized authority to coordinate resources and resolve conflicts. But this explanation requires ignoring the evidence that kingship appears in Mesopotamia already fully formed, with all the supporting institutions already in place, with no archaeological evidence of the gradual development that should exist if the institution was being invented for the first time. It requires ignoring the Sumerian texts that explicitly say, kingship was not invented, but descended. It requires assuming that ancient people did not understand their own history, as well as modern scholars who are reading their texts 4,000 years later. The Sumerian scribes who carved the King List into clay were not writing fiction. They were not creating propaganda. They were recording what they had been taught, what their teachers had been taught, what had been preserved in their scribal schools for generations. And what they recorded was a simple but revolutionary claim that human civilization did not begin with them, that it began before the flood, with rulers who governed for epochs according to patterns established by divine decree, that the flood interrupted this continuity but did not destroy it completely, that when the waters receded, kingship descended again, bringing with it the same structure, the same authority, the same blueprint for how human societies should organize themselves. The word descended is not poetic embellishment. It is historical testimony. And if we listen to what the Sumerians were actually saying, if we take their claims seriously rather than filtering them through our assumptions about how civilization must have developed, then we are forced to acknowledge that the origin of human government is not what we have been taught. It is something stranger, something older, something that came from outside the human societies it was designed to organize. And the question that remains, the question that the King List forces us to ask, is not whether kingship descended. The question is, from where and from whom? The Sumerian flood record is not ancient history. It is current events, not because another deluge is necessarily coming, though geological and astronomical evidence suggests that catastrophic events are cyclical rather than singular. But because the pattern the Sumerians preserved in clay is the pattern that governs all civilizations, sophistication, complacency, catastrophe, collapse, and the desperate scramble to preserve enough knowledge that the survivors can rebuild. This cycle is not mythology. It is observable. It is measurable. It has happened repeatedly throughout recorded history, and each time it happens, the loss is staggering. Libraries burn, languages die, technologies are forgotten, and within a few generations, the descendants of the survivors no longer remember what their ancestors knew. The Sumerian King List is not just a record of ancient rulers. It is a warning, a message carved into clay by people who understood that knowledge is fragile, that civilization is temporary, and that the only defense against total loss is total preservation. Consider what would happen if modern civilization experienced a catastrophe on the scale of the Sumerian flood. Not a gradual decline, not a slow unraveling over centuries, but a sudden collapse, an event that destroys infrastructure, displaces populations, and interrupts the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. How much of our technology would survive? How much of our would be preserved? How many people alive today know how to make paper from raw materials, how to forge metal from ore, how to calculate astronomical positions without computers, how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to build shelter without power tools? The expertise exists, but It is concentrated in specialists. It is documented in books and databases that require electricity to access. It is dependent on supply chains that span continents and manufacturing processes that require industrial infrastructure. If that infrastructure fails, if the power grids collapse, if the communication networks go dark, how much of our accumulated knowledge would survive the first generation? How much would survive the second? The Sumerians faced this question. They experienced the collapse. They lived through the catastrophe that divided their history into before and after. And their response was to encode as much knowledge as possible into formats that could survive without infrastructure. Clay tablets do not require electricity. Cuneiform does not require printing presses. Mathematical constants do not require calculators. Astronomical observations do not require telescopes. The information was stripped down to its essential form and pressed into clay that would harden into permanence. This was not superstition. This was survival protocol. This was a civilization that understood it was living in the aftermath of something terrible and might be living in the prelude to something equally terrible. And therefore, every piece of knowledge that could be preserved had to be preserved in the most durable format available. The flood layer in the archaeological record is not just evidence of water. It is evidence of interruption, of discontinuity, of a moment when the transmission of knowledge was severed and had to be rebuilt from fragments. The 8 feet of sterile silt at represents not just physical destruction, but cultural amnesia. Everything below that layer was forgotten until archaeologists dug it up 4,000 years later. The cities that existed before the flood, the rulers who governed them, the technologies they developed. The astronomical observations they recorded, the mathematical systems they used, all of it buried, all of it lost to the people who lived immediately after the catastrophe. And the only reason we know it existed at all is because some of it was preserved in formats that survived the waters. Stone foundations that could not be washed away. Clay tablets that sank into the mud and hardened there. Memory that was encoded into oral tradition and later transcribed into written form by scribes who understood that if they did not write it down, it would be lost forever. This is the pattern that repeats throughout history. The Library of Alexandria burned, and with it went hundreds of thousands of texts that are now lost. We know they existed because other texts reference them, but we do not know what they contained. We do not know what knowledge was preserved in those scrolls that died in the fire. The Maya codices were systematically destroyed by Spanish conquistadors who considered them pagan heresy. Only 4 survived. 4 books out of thousands. And what those 4 books reveal is a civilization with advanced astronomy, sophisticated mathematics, and a calendar system more accurate than the one Europe was using at the time of contact. What was in the codices that burned? What knowledge was lost? We will never know. The cycle played out again. Sophistication, catastrophe, collapse. And the survivors were left with fragments. The difference between the Sumerian response and the modern response is awareness. The Sumerians knew they were inheritors. They knew their civilization was built on the ruins of something older. They knew the flood had interrupted the transmission of knowledge and that their responsibility was to preserve what remained so the next interruption would not erase everything. Modern civilization has no such awareness. We assume progress is linear. We assume that knowledge, once discovered, is permanent. We assume that the internet has made information indestructible because it exists in multiple copies on servers around the world. But servers require power. Data requires infrastructure. And infrastructure, as the Sumerians learned, is the first thing that fails when catastrophe strikes. Digital storage is more fragile than clay. It requires constant maintenance, constant energy input, constant technological sophistication to access. If the power fails for long enough, if the expertise to maintain the systems is lost, the data might as well not exist. Future archaeologists will find our cities full of devices they cannot read, storage media they cannot access, information encoded in formats that require knowledge we assumed would always be available. The Sumerian King List forces us to confront the possibility that we are not the first advanced civilization. We are simply the current one. And like all the civilizations that came before, we are vulnerable to the same catastrophes that reset previous cycles. Climate change, asteroid impact, supervolcanic eruption, solar flares that destroy electrical grids, pandemic disease, nuclear war. Any of these events could interrupt the transmission of knowledge on a scale that would make the Sumerian flood look minor. And when that interruption comes, if it comes, what will the survivors preserve? What will they consider essential? What will they carve into the most durable formats they have, knowing that everything else might be lost? The Sumerians chose to preserve their king list, their flood narrative, their mathematical tables, their astronomical observations. They preserved the memory of what came before and the warning that it could happen again. What would we choose to preserve? And more importantly, are we preserving it in formats that could survive a collapse of the infrastructure we depend on? The clay tablets are still there. You can visit museums and see them behind glass, these small rectangles of baked earth covered in wedge-shaped marks that most people walk past without stopping. But if you stop, if you look, if you let yourself understand what you are seeing, you realize you are looking at a message, not from the past to the past, but from the past to you. The Sumerians knew they would not survive forever. They knew their cities would eventually crumble and their language would eventually die and their civilization would eventually be buried under sand and forgotten. But they also knew that if they pressed their knowledge into clay and fired it hard enough, it might survive. It might outlast them. It might be found by whoever came next and understood the effort that went into preserving it. And when you stand in front of those tablets, when you read the translations and understand what they are saying, you are receiving that message. You are the person they were trying to reach. You are the future they hoped would remember. The warning is simple. This has happened before. Civilization is not permanent. Knowledge is not guaranteed. The world can end, has ended, and when it ends, the only hope the survivors have is that someone before them understood the cycle and preserved enough information that restoration is possible. The Sumerians did their part. They pressed the warning into clay. They marked the flood layer in the earth. They recorded the king lists and the mathematical tables and the astronomical observations. They built their cities on top of the ruins of older cities, acknowledging that they were part of a sequence, not the beginning of one. Now the question is, what will we do? Will we acknowledge the pattern? Will we preserve our knowledge in formats that could survive us? Will we take responsibility for passing something forward to whoever comes after, the way the Sumerians passed something forward to us? Or will we assume that this time is different, that progress is permanent, that the cycle has been broken, only to learn, as every civilization before us has learned, that the cycle is not a myth. It is geology. It is astronomy. It is the pattern written in water and preserved in clay. And it is waiting for us to decide whether we will heed the warning or ignore it until the waters rise again. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.